He was signing his own son's arrest warrant when the chilling truth struck him. Daniel had never truly known who his father was. While Thomas Miller lay helpless in a cardiac ICU bed fighting for his life, his son was busy forging his signature selling off a $2.3 million beach house and an $890,000 classic car collection like they were nothing more than poker chips. The betrayal cut deeper than the surgery scars, but Daniel's arrogance blinded him to one fatal detail. The real estate company he used to commit the fraud secretly belonged to his father. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from, because what happened next at Daniel's engagement party will leave you speechless. At precisely 6:23 a.m., Thomas Miller's chest ignited with a searing pressure that felt like a freight train tearing through his ribs. He had just poured his morning coffee, steam rising in the dim kitchen light, when the pain stabbed down his left arm. His knees buckled, the mug shattered on the tile, and the world collapsed into darkness. Sirens screamed. He remembered flashes, paramedics shouting, the sharp sting of an IV needle, the sterile blur of hospital lights racing above him. By the time his eyes opened again, he was in Mount Sinai's cardiac ICU tubes and wires binding him to life, his heart barely holding on. And sitting at his bedside with tears carefully balanced on his cheeks like an actor rehearsing a role, was Daniel, his only son. "Dad." "Thank God you're awake," Daniel whispered, gripping his father's frail hand. His voice cracked in all the right places. His eyes glistened as if grief had sculpted them. He leaned close, shaking his head in solemn relief. "The doctors weren't sure you'd make it. But you did. You're going to be okay. And don't worry about anything, I'll handle it all while you recover." Thomas, groggy from morphine and the weight of a triple bypass surgery, wanted to believe him. He wanted to cling to the notion that his son had matured into the kind of man who could shoulder responsibility with integrity. Gratitude flickered through the fog of pain. Yet beneath it, like a faint echo, there was unease. Daniel's words had come too quickly, too rehearsed, too eager. But Thomas's body betrayed him. He was too weak to challenge anything. He nodded faintly, his breath shallow, and drifted back into medicated sleep. For 13 days, Thomas hovered between worlds, slipping in and out of consciousness. Each time he surfaced, Daniel was there, immaculate in pressed shirts, phone always in hand, smiling down like a dutiful son. He spoke of bills already paid, property taxes handled, insurance paperwork completed. He assured Thomas that life outside those hospital walls was under control. The staff adored him. Nurses called him devoted visitors, called him responsible, and even Dr. Avery, the cardiologist, commended his attentiveness. To everyone else, Daniel was the image of a son rising to the occasion. To Thomas, he was a silhouette blurred by morphine-speaking words he wanted to trust but couldn't quite anchor. On January 20th, the hospital conducted a mental competency exam standard for a patient his age after surgery. The questions were precise memory recall, problem-solving comprehension. Despite his weakened body, Thomas scored nearly perfectly. His mind remained sharp, his awareness intact. The results were logged, sealed into his medical file. It was a detail that seemed insignificant in that sterile room, but would later become a blade in Daniel's undoing. On January 28th, Thomas was discharged. The winter sun was bright as Daniel drove him home, not in the old pickup Thomas had loved for decades, but in Daniel's gleaming BMW. "Where's my truck?" Thomas asked weakly, his voice rasping against the hum of the engine. Daniel's eyes stayed on the road. "In the shop, Dad." "Don't worry about it. Just focus on resting." When they pulled into the driveway, a chill raced down Thomas's spine. His garage stood hollow, the echo of absence screaming louder than any alarm. Gone were the restored classics he had poured his soul into: the 1967 Mustang Shelby GT500, the 1963 Corvette split window, the 1969 Camaro SS. Empty concrete and oil stains remained like ghosts of devotion betrayed. Daniel Thomas rasped, stepping out onto shaky legs, clutching the car door for balance. "Where are my cars?" Daniel hurried to his side, taking his elbow as though steadying him from the dizziness. His eyes slid away. "Dad, you were really sick. I had to make tough decisions. The insurance costs were sky high and you weren't driving them anyway. You sold them." Thomas's words cracked not from the heart surgery, but from rage carving through his chest. "Please," Daniel murmured, his tones silky with false reassurance. "You need to rest. We'll talk later." But Thomas was already moving, each step slow but certain, leading him down the familiar path toward the beach. And there it was, where his house had stood overlooking the Atlantic, a towering "sold" sign staked into the ground like a dagger. The letters glared at him in red, bold and merciless. Beneath it read, "Wilson Coastal Properties." He gripped the wooden post, his knuckles white. That house was his masterpiece, every nail and board laid by his own hands in 1987. His late wife Linda had stood with him on that deck during their first dance, her laughter carried by the salt air. She had died in that living room holding his hand. And now, with one greedy stroke, Daniel had erased it all. "Dad, listen," Daniel said, standing behind him, calm as if delivering news about the weather. "You were dying. The medical bills were going to bury us. I had to protect your financial future. I liquidated assets. It's just real estate, Dad. It's about cash flow. You taught me that." Thomas turned his eyes, burning, his voice low and trembling. "You protected my future by selling my home." Daniel lifted his chin, confidence simmering in his smirk. "I put everything into high-yield investments. You'll thank me later." Later. That word hung in the cold air, toxic and hollow. When Thomas demanded paperwork, Daniel produced a neat folder. Inside pages of power of attorney documents bore Thomas's signature, except they were frauds. The handwriting mimicked his own, but Thomas had signed legal contracts for decades. He knew his penmanship as well as he knew his pulse. These marks were close, but they were counterfeit, each curve and stroke betraying its lie. "When did I sign these?" His voice was a blade. "January 22nd. Daniel replied smoothly. "You were lucid that morning right before your second procedure." But Thomas remembered. On January 22nd, he had been unconscious for 18 straight hours. The medical logs confirmed it. Daniel had forged everything, exploiting the stillness of his father's body, assuming his mind had weakened with it. As the waves crashed against the shore behind him, Thomas stood rigid, staring at the sun he no longer recognized. The betrayal was not just theft, it was desecration. The boy he had raised, the heir he had once envisioned inheriting his empire, had turned predator, circling the vulnerability of his father's weakest moment. Yet Daniel had miscalculated. He had overlooked the truth hidden beneath the surface. His father's mind was intact, sharp, and relentless. And most damning of all, he had unknowingly funneled his crime through the very company his father owned. Thomas's body trembled, the winter wind biting his skin. But the storm inside him was colder still. Daniel thought he had robbed a dying man, silenced a legacy. What he had done instead was awaken a force he would never comprehend. Because Thomas Miller was no feeble old man watching the tide of life swallow him whole. He was a builder, a fighter, and a man whose silence was more dangerous than any scream. And as he stood before the sold sign, the betrayal etched into his bones, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: his son had just declared war on the wrong man. And the reckoning was only beginning. The morning air was sharp with salt and frost when Thomas stepped through the doorway of his home for the first time since the surgery. His chest still ached with every breath, the stitches tugging against his skin, but it was not the pain of his healing heart that froze him in place. It was the silence of the garage. He reached for the light switch, the hum of the bulb flickering against bare concrete. Empty. The garage that had once sung with the gleam of chrome and the scent of oil and leather was hollow now, a cavern echoing back only the soft rasp of his breath. He stepped forward, slowly gripping the doorframe as if his legs might betray him. His hand trailed along the wall where the Mustang had once been parked, fingers brushing dust that clung like betrayal. The Corvette's corner where he had polished every curve with reverence now held only shadows. The Camaro's place, marked by faint oil stains, was void as though years of devotion had been wiped clean in a single night. Thomas's eyes burned, but not with tears. Something darker was rising, something raw. He staggered outside the winter sun glaring against the Atlantic horizon. And there it was, bold and merciless, standing where his heart had once found peace. A white post, a red sign, one word carved like a blade. Sold. The letters bled into him, an accusation, a sentence, a scar. The beach house that had carried every chapter of his family's life, the first dance with Linda under the porch lights. Daniel's boyhood summers building sandcastles, while Linda laughed with wine in her hand. The nights of storms when he'd stood guard at the windows to make sure the ocean stayed outside was no longer his. It had been stripped from him without warning, without consent. He gripped the wooden post, the chill cutting into his palm, and turned slowly to where Daniel stood behind him. His son's hands were tucked casually into his coat pockets, eyes half-lidded with the kind of smug calm that came only from certainty. "Dad." Daniel began, his tone coated in reason. "This is about security. You were in no condition to manage any of it. I stepped in. I made sure nothing collapsed. These are just assets numbers on paper. They don't define you. I reinvested everything. It's all working for you now." The words hung in the air, slick and poisonous. Assets. Numbers. Working for you. Daniel spoke as though the house had not been a home, as though the cars had not been years of sweat and sacrifice, as though the memories embedded in every wall and every mile could be reduced to figures in a ledger. Thomas stared at him, his chest rising and falling in ragged rhythm. He searched for the boy he once knew, the child who had clutched his hand at the county fair, who had begged for stories at bedtime, who had once looked at him with eyes full of trust. But there was only this man now, dressed in confidence, speaking of profit, where there should have been love. "You sold it!" Thomas whispered, his voice breaking like brittle glass. Daniel stepped closer, his shoulders squared, his mouth curving into the faintest shadow of a smile. "I preserved it." "You would have lost it all. Medical debt, taxes, maintenance. It would have crushed you." "I did what you couldn't." "You'll see. You'll thank me. Thank me." The words reverberated obscene. Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. Gratitude was not what clawed at his throat. It was rage, hot and unfamiliar in its ferocity. For years he had shouldered Daniel's mistakes, paid his debts, forgiven his recklessness. But this was not a mistake. This was calculation, cold and deliberate, carried out while his father lay cut open on a table. The wind snapped against the sold sign, the rope creaking where it lashed the post. Thomas turned his gaze back to the house, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The deck where Linda's laughter once lingered now felt like a grave sealed off by his own blood. Daniel shifted, pulling out his phone, scrolling as though the conversation was complete. "It's all legal," he muttered. "Handled through Wilson Coastal. Smooth and clean. You should be proud. Your legacy is secure." Thomas's jaw clenched. Wilson Coastal. The name rang like a bell deep within him. He had built that company brick by brick, kept its ownership buried behind trusts and layered holdings. Daniel, in his arrogance, had used the very empire his father commanded, blind to the fact that every transaction, every forged signature, every theft now flowed directly into the man standing before him. The taste of bile rose in Thomas's throat, but he swallowed it down. Anger was fuel, but fury could betray him too soon. He steadied his breathing, forced his hands to unclench, forced his face into stillness. Daniel thought him broken, fragile, dependent. Let him believe it. Let him think the battle was already won. Because standing on that shore with the waves crashing and the sign mocking Thomas, saw not only betrayal, but opportunity. His son had revealed himself careless, arrogant, certain of his own cleverness. That certainty was a flaw, and flaws could be broken wide open. He turned from the house, his steps measured, his voice low. You've made choices, Daniel. Choices you can't undo. Daniel barely looked up, his thumbs flicking across his phone screen. I've made the right ones, Dad. You'll understand soon enough. Thomas walked past him, the sea wind whipping his coat, the anger now solidifying into something colder, sharper. Every muscle ached from surgery, every step was weighted with exhaustion, but the fire inside him had eclipsed the weakness of his body. He knew now. He knew the shape of the battlefield, the arrogance of his enemy, the stakes that had been set without his consent. And as he reached the door, pausing in the threshold where light and shadow met, he let the thought settle heavy and electric. The son who believed he had stolen everything had, without realizing, placed his neck in the noose. What came next would not be shouted, nor rushed, nor revealed in anger. It would unfold with precision, like the slow tightening of a vise. And when the pressure finally snapped, the illusion Daniel had built, it would not just shatter his schemes, it would dismantle him entirely. Thomas closed the door behind him, the echo of its latch sealing the moment. The beach house might have been sold, the cars might have vanished, but the war had only just begun, and Daniel was already standing on quicksand. And deep down, Thomas knew the next crack in this fragile facade would come sooner than his son ever imagined. The folder sat heavy in Thomas's lap, its edges worn from hands that weren't his. He had asked for it calmly, his voice steady even as suspicion clawed at his chest. Daniel had hesitated for a second too long before sliding the documents across the kitchen table, but the hesitation vanished behind a polished smile. Thomas opened the first page and the world seemed to tilt. His name, written in sharp blue ink, looped and curved across line after line. Power of attorney, property transfers, vehicle titles, all bearing a signature that mimicked his own. At first glance it was flawless, but Thomas knew every detail of his penmanship, every pressure mark, every hesitation in his hand. These strokes were mechanical, rehearsed, lacking the weight of a man who had signed his life in contracts and ledgers for half a century. They were imitations, empty shells of his truth. The breath caught in his throat. He flipped through more pages, each one a theft dressed in his own name. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms folded as if watching a deal close. "You don't need to worry, Dad," he said lightly, tapping his phone against the table. "It's all buttoned up. You signed everything. Remember before the second procedure. You were alert. The doctors even confirmed it." Thomas's eyes narrowed, the sting of betrayal sharpening into clarity. He remembered those hours. He had been unconscious, drifting in the haze of anesthesia and painkillers, his mind locked in darkness. He could not have signed anything. He lifted his gaze from the forged pages to Daniel's face, studying the calm mask his son wore, the confidence of a man convinced he had outsmarted the world. But then came the detail that twisted the knife deeper. At the bottom of each page in neat print was the name of the brokerage that had processed the transactions. Wilson Coastal Properties, Thomas's own company. He had built it from nothing, hidden his ownership behind layers of trusts and silent partners. Daniel had chosen it by accident, never knowing his father still commanded its foundations. The irony was a poison and a revelation all at once. Not only had Daniel forged his father's name, he had done so under the very roof his father controlled. Every fraudulent document, every notarized lie, every false transfer now lay recorded in a system Thomas could access with a single call. Daniel thought himself clever, but in his arrogance he had walked straight into his father's shadow. The silence in the room grew sharp, pressing against the walls. Thomas closed the folder slowly, his fingers trembling not from weakness but from the storm gathering inside him. "These are not my signatures," he said finally, his voice low, each word weighted with steel. Daniel laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Dad, you've been through a lot. Maybe you don't remember. It's common after major surgery. Memory lapses, confusion. That's why you needed me to step in." The insult hit harder than the lie. It wasn't just theft. It was condescension, a son painting his father as senile, unfit, disposable. Rage surged through Thomas's veins, cold and precise. For years he had carried Daniel's failures, covering debts, smoothing over scandals, pretending his son was more than the reckless gambler he truly was. But this was no recklessness. This was calculated. This was betrayal carved with intent. He rose from his chair, every stitch in his chest pulling tight, but he stood tall. "You think you've erased me with ink?" he said quietly, eyes locked on Daniel. "But signatures don't lie, Daniel. Not to me." Daniel's smile faltered just for a flicker before he masked it again with practiced arrogance. "Everything is done. The house, the cars, it's final. The money is already moving. You can fight it if you want, but the law is on my side. I made sure of it." The arrogance was almost laughable. The law was not on his side. It was in his father's hands. Wilson Coastal kept meticulous records down to the timestamp of every keystroke, the ID of every employee who entered a transaction. All Thomas needed was one call to peel back the layers and expose the rot. But he did not call. Not yet. Timing was everything. Striking too soon would only cause Daniel to cover his tracks, to bury evidence that Thomas needed to crush him completely. So he let the silence stretch, let Daniel believe the performance was working. He nodded slowly, as though conceding, as though buying into the illusion of weakness. Inside, though, the fury burned. He thought of Linda, her last words urging him never to hand over the empire without proof of worth. He thought of the nights spent alone, building brick upon brick while Daniel squandered privilege into dust. And now, sitting across from him, Thomas no longer saw a son. He saw a thief cloaked in his bloodline, a traitor convinced his father's silence equaled surrender. But Thomas Miller had survived open-heart surgery. He had survived the death of his wife, the collapse of markets, the betrayals of business partners who thought they could outwit him. He would survive this too, and when the reckoning came, it would not be loud. It would be surgical, precise, devastating. He closed the folder, set it on the table, and met his son's eyes with a stillness that unnerved Daniel more than any shout could have. "Enjoy your victory," he said softly. "It will be the shortest one you've ever had." Daniel leaned back, smirking again, but there was a flicker in his gaze, a hesitation he couldn't disguise. He forced a chuckle, picked up his phone, and muttered something about meetings, investments, people waiting on him. He left the kitchen with the swagger of a man convinced he had won. Thomas stayed seated, staring at the folder, listening to the echo of footsteps fade. His hands tightened on the wood grain of the table, steady now, his heart beat stronger with each thrum. The pain in his chest was no longer weakness. It was fuel. Upstairs in the locked drawer of his study lay the original trust documents, untouched, unaltered proof of ownership that Daniel could never erase. The key rested in Thomas's pocket, pressing against his thigh like a reminder, like a weapon. And as he sat in the quiet, the storm outside rolling in from the Atlantic, he allowed himself the faintest smile. Daniel believed he had closed every door, forged every page, outmaneuvered his father. But the truth was waiting, patient and merciless. And when it surfaced, it would not just expose Daniel's fraud. It would strip him bare in front of everyone who had ever believed his lies. The house may have been sold, the cars may have vanished, but the truth was still in Thomas's hands. And the next move he made would break Daniel's illusion into pieces too sharp to ever mend. The storm lingered outside, waves pounding the shore like a war drum, but inside the study it was silent except for the ticking of an old mantel clock. Thomas sat in his leather chair, the folder of forged documents closed on the desk before him. His fingers traced its edge not out of doubt, but as if to remind himself that this was real, that his own son had carved betrayal into paper and called it love. His eyes wandered not to the evidence, but to the photograph framed on the shelf beside him. Linda's smile frozen in sunlight, her hair caught by the wind the day they moved into the beach house. For a moment the fury that burned in his veins ebbed, replaced by the ache of absence that had shadowed him since she died. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and the room blurred. He could hear her laugh, that light ripple that once filled every corner of this home. He could almost feel her hand on his shoulder, the gentle squeeze she used when she wanted him to stand taller. And then he remembered the letter. It had been the last thing she left for him, tucked inside the drawer of her nightstand, discovered only after the funeral, when the silence of the house pressed too heavy on his chest. The handwriting had been shaky, her illness stealing steadiness from her, but the words carried her voice with undeniable strength. Make him prove his worth. Don't let him take everything without learning what it means to earn. Love him, yes, but love him enough to let him face consequences. He had read those lines 100 times in the months since she passed, sometimes with tears blurring the ink, sometimes with anger rising against the unfairness of it all. But tonight, with Daniel's forgery still fresh in his hands, the letter was no longer just a memory. It was a command. Thomas rose slowly, his body still stiff from surgery, and opened the drawer where he had kept the letter safe. The envelope was worn now, edges frayed from years of unfolding and refolding, but the paper inside was intact. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing it across the desk beside the fraudulent contracts. Linda's words stared back at him, quiet but unyielding. He could almost hear her whispering from beyond the grave, reminding him that weakness disguised as forgiveness had never saved anyone. He thought of the years he had spent trying to shield Daniel from failure. The debts he had paid, the fines he had covered, the mistakes he had hidden. Every time he told himself it was fatherly duty, that protecting his son was love. But Linda had seen further. She had known what Thomas had refused to admit, that coddling Daniel had not built him into a man. It had built him into a predator, hungry and entitled, convinced that his father's empire was his birthright to be consumed without effort or cost. The truth cut sharper than the scalpel that had opened his chest weeks earlier. He had allowed this. By shielding his son from pain, he had taught him to believe there were no consequences. And now, sitting with Linda's letter in one hand and Daniel's lies in the other, Thomas felt the weight of that mistake pressing down like a stone. But there was something else in that weight, something he had not felt in years: clarity. He rose from the chair and walked toward the bookshelf, pulling down the old family album. Inside were photographs spanning decades, weddings, birthdays, summers at the beach. In each one, Linda's presence anchored them, her eyes bright with the pride of a woman who had believed her family's foundation was unbreakable. He paused at one photo in particular, Linda holding Daniel as a baby on the porch of the beach house, the ocean at their backs. She had looked at their son as though he was the beginning of everything. Thomas closed the album, his jaw tightening. That hope had died with her, and Daniel had smothered the rest with greed. The anger returned, but it was different now. No longer wild, no longer scorching through his veins without direction. It was tempered, honed, forged into something usable. He looked again at Linda's words, and for the first time he understood. Love was not covering his son's crimes. Love was refusing to let him escape the consequences. He walked to the window, the storm outside clawing at the glass. The Atlantic roared relentless, indifferent, much like the empire he had built. Wilson Coastal Properties had survived recessions, hurricanes, betrayals from partners who once swore loyalty. It had survived because Thomas knew when to strike, when to wait, when to reveal the truth. And it would survive this too. Daniel thought he had buried his father beneath forgeries and arrogance. He thought the man who raised him was too weak to fight back. But Thomas could feel Linda's presence in the storm, in the letter, in the echo of her voice urging him to act. He would not fail her again. He folded the letter carefully and slid it back into its envelope, placing it in the drawer once more. Then he returned to the desk, unlocking the bottom cabinet with a small brass key. Inside were files older than Daniel himself, trust deeds, original contracts, undisclosed holdings that tied Wilson Coastal back to its true owner. He pulled them out one by one, laying them beside the forged papers. The contrast was striking the truth against the lie. Thomas's hands no longer shook. His chest no longer ached with weakness. What filled him now was resolve, a steady hum that coursed through his veins like an engine coming back to life. He would not shout. He would not plead. He would do what he had always done: calculate, prepare, and strike with precision. He imagined the look on Daniel's face when the trap snapped shut, when the truth came crashing down in front of witnesses who mattered. He imagined the arrogance shattering, the smirk collapsing into panic. That image did not bring joy. It brought justice. He turned off the desk lamp, leaving the room in darkness. The storm outside had begun to fade, the waves softening into rhythm. Yet inside him the storm was only just beginning. He could almost hear Linda's voice again, steady and unwavering. Make him prove his worth. And Thomas knew he would, because the time for silence had passed. The reckoning was no longer a thought, no longer a plan, it was inevitable. And the next move would be his. The next morning the air was brittle with cold, the kind of morning when the sea mist clung to the windows and silence pressed hard against the walls. Thomas sat in his study, the lamp still burning from the night before, files stacked high on his desk. He had barely slept, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. Rage had burned itself down to embers, and in its place was something harder, something colder, resolve. He reached for the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months, a number etched into his memory long before betrayal had turned his son into a stranger. Margaret Lewis answered on the third ring. Her voice, steady as stone, carried the same steel it had decades earlier when they had started Wilson Coastal together. "Thomas, I was wondering when I'd hear from you." He said nothing at first, only letting her words settle in the room like an omen. Then he exhaled, slow and deliberate. "It's time, Margaret. He's crossed the line." Within the hour she was at his house, her presence filling the study with the weight of a woman who had spent a lifetime tearing through lies and carving truth from shadows. She carried a leather case worn at the corners, heavy with the kind of evidence no thief could outrun. They sat across from each other at the desk, the storm outside now only a whisper, and Thomas slid the forged documents toward her. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning each page with the precision of a scalpel. "These signatures are sloppy," she muttered, tapping one with her pen. "Convincing to a clerk maybe, but not to anyone who knows your hand. He didn't even try to mimic the pressure of your stroke. Arrogant." Thomas leaned back, his gaze fixed on the folder as though it might ignite. "He counted on me being too weak to notice, too grateful, too blind. He forgot who I am." Margaret's lips curved into a grim line. "Then we remind him." They worked in silence for hours, combing through records, lining up every discrepancy. She pulled out property deeds from the archives, laying them side by side with the forged transfers. The inconsistencies screamed from the pages, different ink compositions, mismatched notary stamps, dates that collided with hospital logs. Every detail was a nail in Daniel's coffin. When the paper trail was solid, Margaret opened her case again and drew out a flash drive. "Surveillance," she explained. "We keep recordings on every transaction at Wilson Coastal, even those processed through satellite offices. Standard protocol. And your son didn't know that." Thomas's pulse quickened as she plugged the drive into his computer. The screen flickered, then filled with grainy footage. There was Daniel sitting across from a junior broker, document spread out on the table. His face was calm, his smile easy, the same smile he had used to charm teachers out of discipline and girlfriends out of doubt. But it wasn't charm. It was wrought, polished into shine. The camera caught him signing. Not his father's hand, not his father's pen, but his own, tracing the name of Thomas Miller, with the confidence of a man convinced no one would ever look. He leaned back after each stroke, chatting casually, sipping from a paper cup of coffee like it was any other day. Thomas's jaw tightened as he watched, but his chest was steady. No rage, no despair, only certainty. The proof was no longer abstract. It was alive on the screen, his son betraying him in high definition. Margaret paused the video, turning to him. "This is more than enough to destroy him legally. Forgery, fraud, embezzlement. He'll go to prison for years." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Not yet. Prison is inevitable. But I want him to feel it first. I want the world to see what he is before the cell door closes. He's spent his life performing. Let's make sure his final performance ends with the mask ripped off." Margaret studied him, her eyes narrowing. "You've already chosen your battlefield." He nodded. "His engagement. 200 people. Investors, family, friends. He'll stand there bragging about the empire he thinks he controls. And that's when it ends. She leaned back, the corner of her mouth lifting. Then we'll need precision. Timing, witnesses, documentation airtight. He won't wriggle out of this one. Thomas reached into his drawer and pulled out the envelope containing Linda's letter. He didn't open it, didn't need to. Her words lived inside him now, guiding every move. He slid it across the desk toward Margaret. She warned me. She knew what he was capable of. This is more than business. This is her legacy, too. Margaret placed her hand over the envelope briefly, a silent acknowledgement. Then she gathered the documents, slotting them into her case with deliberate care. I'll prepare the filings. But Thomas, you need to be ready for what comes after. Once this begins, there's no going back. He won't just be ruined, he'll be exposed. Thomas's eyes hardened. That's the point. He thought he could erase me with a pen. Let him learn what it means to be erased by truth. As Margaret left that night, the house seemed different. The walls, once suffocating with silence, now felt alive with purpose. Thomas walked to the window, watching her taillights fade into the mist. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, older, scarred, but no longer broken. He had been cut open, stitched back together, betrayed by his own blood, but now he was more dangerous than ever. The Atlantic whispered beyond the dunes, endless and indifferent, but Thomas no longer felt small before it. He felt aligned with its force, unyielding, inevitable, relentless. Upstairs, he sat at Linda's old writing desk and began drafting a letter of his own, not to Daniel, but to the people who would soon see Daniel for who he truly was. Every word was measured sharp, a blade cloaked in civility. When the time came, this letter would circulate faster than gossip, striking deeper than rumor. It would be the opening shot of a war Daniel never saw coming. When the clock struck midnight, Thomas extinguished the lamp. The house settled into darkness, but inside him the fire burned steady, cold, and controlled. His son believed the game was already won, that the empire was his. What he didn't know was that the game had only just begun, and the rules were about to change forever. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of a wall clock. It was late, the kind of late when the world outside seemed to disappear into darkness and only the people inside mattered. Thomas waited in the kitchen, the overhead light casting long shadows across the tiled floor. His body ached, the scars from surgery pulling with every movement, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had rehearsed this moment in silence, and now the stage was set. Daniel entered without suspicion, his phone glowing in his hand, the faint buzz of incoming messages lighting up his face. He poured himself a glass of bourbon ice, clinking against the crystal, and leaned casually against the counter. He looked at his father as if he were a piece of furniture present, but no longer relevant. Thomas let the silence stretch before speaking. "You've been busy," he said, his tone calm, almost conversational. Daniel smirked, sipping from his glass. "Someone has to be. You were out of commission for weeks. I had to take care of everything. The house, the cars, the finances. Don't worry, Dad, I kept the ship afloat." Thomas studied him carefully, his expression unreadable. He tapped his hand lightly against the table as if considering the words. Hidden in the fold of his sleeve, the small digital recorder blinked silently, capturing every syllable. "You handled the house?" Thomas repeated slowly, his eyes never leaving his son. "You handled the cars. And what exactly did you do with them?" Daniel hesitated, but only for a second. Confidence returned like a mask slipping back into place. "I sold what needed to be sold. Liquidated assets, reinvested in better opportunities. You wouldn't understand the markets the way I do. Crypto startups overseas, ventures, big money, Dad. Smart money." Thomas tilted his head slightly, a gesture of feigned curiosity. "And you think selling a family home vehicles that meant more than numbers was smart money?" Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "You're stuck in the past. Nostalgia doesn't pay bills. Sentiment doesn't grow portfolios. Look, I got top dollar for everything. Nearly 3.2 million liquid. And I put it to work immediately. High yield returns, aggressive plays. You'll see. We're going to be richer than ever." The words hung in the air thick and poisonous. Thomas felt his pulse steady, not race. The admission was unfolding even faster than he had expected. Daniel, drunk on arrogance and bourbon, couldn't stop himself. Thomas leaned back, his voice low, steady. "So you forged my signature. You moved assets without consent. You funneled the money into ventures I never approved." Daniel waved a dismissive hand, rolling his eyes. "Consent, signatures, approval. It's semantics. You were out cold, hooked up to machines. Someone had to act, and I did. Besides, I didn't exactly waste it. I invested. That's not theft. That's initiative." Thomas let out a slow breath, controlling the fury that wanted to rise. "Initiative." "Yeah," Daniel said, grinning, the alcohol loosening his tongue further. "You always said winners take risks." "Well, I took risks. I forged, I signed, I moved money. And I'd do it again. Because when this pays off, no one will care how it started. They'll only see the results." The recorder blinked again. Every word captured, preserved, transformed into a blade Thomas would wield at the perfect moment. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching between them like a chasm. Daniel sipped his bourbon again, unaware that his own mouth had just condemned him. Thomas sat still, his face carved in stone, but inside there was a flicker of satisfaction, a quiet hum of triumph. He had it now. Proof. Not just documents, not just suspicions, his son's own voice confessing to betrayal. The kitchen light buzzed faintly, a moth batting itself against the bulb. Daniel broke the silence first, sighing. "You're not saying anything. You should be thanking me. Do you realize how close you were to losing everything? Without me, it would have all gone under. You should be proud. I had the guts to do what you couldn't." Thomas finally spoke, his voice like ice. "Proud." The word cut through the air, sharp, deliberate. "You think betrayal deserves pride." Daniel scoffed, setting his glass down with a clink. "Betrayal. Don't be dramatic. This is survival. This is legacy. You should be grateful the Miller name will be attached to millions more because of me." For a brief second, Thomas almost laughed, not from humor, but from the bitter irony of it. His son, so desperate for validation, so convinced of his brilliance, was blind to the noose tightening around his neck. He had handed over everything, motive, method, confession. And he had done it with the arrogance of a man who believed the world revolved around him. Thomas rose slowly, every movement deliberate, the chair scraping softly against the tile. He walked to the counter, standing close enough to see his own reflection in Daniel's glass. His voice was low, dangerous in its restraint. "You've said more tonight than you realize." Daniel raised a brow, grinning as if it were a game. "Good. Maybe it's time you finally listened." Thomas studied him for a long moment, his silence sharper than any accusation. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Daniel alone with his bourbon and his ignorance. Upstairs, in the privacy of his study, Thomas placed the recorder on his desk and pressed stop. The red light blinked out the silence final. He rewound a few seconds, listening to Daniel's voice play back through the speaker. "I forged, I signed, I moved money. And I'd do it again." The words filled the room like a verdict, undeniable, irreversible. Thomas sat back, a cold smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The anger was gone, replaced by the steady calm of a man who now held every card. He glanced once more at Linda's letter, then at the files Margaret had helped organize. The plan was unfolding piece by piece, and Daniel had just sealed his own fate with his tongue. The night stretched on, but Thomas felt no weariness. He had proof now. He had power. And soon, in the one place Daniel craved admiration most, that proof would strip him bare in front of everyone he sought to impress. The engagement party was coming, and Thomas knew exactly how to turn his son's celebration into his downfall. The days that followed moved with a rhythm of calculated silence. Thomas no longer wasted time staring at the ocean or the empty spaces where his cars had once gleamed. He buried himself in preparation, in the meticulous work of building a case so airtight that not even Daniel's silver tongue could slip through it. Every morning began at the long oak desk in his study, piles of folders stacked like ammunition, his pen carving notes with the precision of a scalpel. He was not a grieving father anymore. He was a strategist, sharpening his blade. Margaret returned often, her sharp eyes scanning every document, cross-referencing every line. Together they mapped out the web Daniel had spun: fake signatures, bogus transfers, shell accounts scattered across state lines. Each discrepancy was logged, highlighted, bound into neat packets that would one day be held up as proof. The evidence grew until the study could no longer contain it. Boxes lined the hallway, filled with files, transcripts, and recordings, each one a nail for the coffin his son had built with his own arrogance. But Thomas knew paper alone would not destroy Daniel. His son's strength lay in appearances, in the careful mask he wore for the world. To break him, the mask had to be ripped off in public, in front of the very people whose admiration he craved most. That was where Elena Ramirez entered. She was a private investigator with a reputation for finding rot in places most believed spotless. Elena had once exposed a senator's offshore accounts with nothing but a diner receipt and a security tape. Now she was Thomas's shadow, moving through Daniel's life with quiet efficiency. For weeks she tracked the trail of excess hotel bills and Dubai wire transfers to unregistered startups, nights lost in Manhattan penthouses where champagne flowed like water and company came with a price tag. She photographed him sliding diamond watches across tables, bribing officials with envelopes thick as books, laughing in the glow of neon clubs, while the ink on his father's forged name was still wet. Every night she delivered her findings to Thomas. Photos, receipts, recordings of whispered deals in parking garages. The evidence was more than criminal, it was damning to Daniel's reputation. He had not only stolen, he had flaunted it. He had burned through millions like gasoline, convinced the fire made him untouchable. Thomas studied each piece with a detached calm, the fury of before now tempered into something icier. He was past grief, past rage. He was waiting. The engagement party loomed closer with each passing day. Daniel had spared no expense renting the grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel, a place where chandeliers sparkled like constellations and every step echoed wealth. Invitations had gone out to more than 200 guests, investors, politicians, family friends, and society's elite. The evening was to be his coronation, the moment he cemented himself not only as a wealthy heir, but as a man of stature, brilliance, and control. And Thomas would be there, silent in the crowd, carrying the weight of truth like a hidden blade. He rehearsed the moment over and over in his mind. The lights dimming the glasses raised Daniel's smug voice, thanking his fiancée's family for their support. And then the reveal. The documents, the recordings, the photographs, every layer of fraud and betrayal laid bare in front of the people whose approval Daniel craved like oxygen. It would not be enough for the world to know he was guilty. The world had to see him collapse. The night before the party, Thomas sat alone in the study. The storm had passed, the ocean-calm moonlight spilling across the sand. He placed Linda's letter on the desk beside the recorder, the evidence, the photographs. Her voice echoed in his memory, steady and certain. Make him prove his worth. He whispered to the empty room. Tomorrow, Linda. Tomorrow he proves it. Sleep never came. He stayed awake, pacing the hallways, rehearsing the words he would speak, though he knew in truth he would need very few. It was Daniel's own voice that would condemn him, Daniel's own arrogance that would tear him down. Thomas only had to choose the moment, the strike that would end the illusion. By morning the house was still. He dressed with care, not in grief or weakness, but in the armor of dignity. A tailored suit, dark and sharp, the kind he had once worn to close billion-dollar deals. The mirror reflected a man older, scarred, but not broken. A man ready to end what never should have begun. At noon, Margaret arrived with the files, Elena with the photographs. Together they loaded the evidence into discreet black cases carried like instruments of war. Thomas locked the door behind him, his hand lingering on the key, knowing the man who left this house today would not return the same. The Harrington rose above the city skyline, glass and marble gleaming in the afternoon sun. Cars pulled into the circular drive, guests stepping out in gowns and tuxedos, laughter drifting on the winter air. Inside the ballroom glowed with gold light, waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne. The air hummed with expectation, the murmur of 200 voices rising in anticipation of the night ahead. Daniel was already at the center, his arm around his bride-to-be, his smile wide and false, his words smooth as silk. He moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who believed he was invincible, who believed every eye adored him, every hand extended in respect. Thomas stood at the edge of the room, unseen, a shadow among glittering lights. In his breast pocket the recorder rested. In his hand, a folded letter from Linda. The weight of both grounded him, reminded him of the truth. He let his gaze sweep the crowd, the stage, the chandelier above. Every detail etched into his mind, every moment aligning into place. The time was near. And as the music swelled, as Daniel lifted his glass for the first toast of the evening, Thomas knew the next breath would mark the beginning of his son's end. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers, every crystal catching the golden light and scattering it across gowns and tuxedos. Laughter rippled through the air like champagne bubbles, shallow and sparkling. A crowd 200 strong gathered to witness Daniel's coronation as a man of wealth and promise. Katherine Johnson, radiant in ivory silk, clung to his arm, her family beaming with the satisfaction of having chosen well. Daniel basked in it, his voice carrying over the music, smooth and practiced, each sentence designed to dazzle. He raised his glass, the rim catching the light. "This year has been extraordinary," he declared, his grin wide, his eyes scanning the room as though each guest were there solely to honor him. "Our ventures have doubled in value, properties secured, assets leveraged. Risk is the currency of greatness, and I've never been afraid to spend it. To Katherine, to family, to the future we are building," applause erupted. Glasses lifted, the sound swelling like thunder. But from the edge of the room, another sound pierced the applause. A single click, sharp and deliberate, the noise of a recorder snapping to life. The ballroom stilled, the applause fading into uneasy silence as a familiar voice filled the air, not Thomas's but Daniel's. His own words, cold and arrogant, now broadcast for all to hear. "I forged, I signed, I moved money. And I'd do it again. Because when this pays off, no one will care how it started. They'll only see the results." The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the recorder. Katherine's hand slipped from Daniel's arm, her face paling, her eyes narrowing with disbelief. Her father's jaw tightened, the champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. Waiters stopped mid-step. Every eye turned toward Daniel, whose smile had collapsed into something brittle, desperate. Thomas stepped forward, no longer a shadow, but a presence that filled the room. His cane tapped against the marble floor. Steady, deliberate, each step pulling the weight of truth closer to the man who had betrayed him. He held up a folder thick with evidence and set it on a table near the center. His voice, low and steady, cut through the stunned silence. "These are the documents my son claims I signed. Forgeries, every one of them. Verified, time-stamped, and recorded under the roof of my own company." Gasps echoed, a ripple of disbelief sweeping across the crowd. Katherine's mother leaned toward her daughter, whispering sharply, her eyes wide with humiliation. Investors exchanged glances, lips curling into murmurs of scandal. The fragile facade Daniel had built brick by forged brick began to crumble before their eyes. Daniel raised his hands, his voice strained, brittle with desperation. "This is a trick. He's old, confused. He doesn't know what he's saying." But even as the words left his mouth, his own voice betrayed him again from the recorder. "Consent, signatures, approval. It's semantics. You were out cold, hooked up to machines. Someone had to act, and I did." The effect was devastating. Katherine's face twisted, not with sorrow, but with disgust. She pulled off the ring, the diamond catching the light one last time before she dropped it into his palm with a sharp clink. The Johnson family turned their backs. Their pride shattered, their investment in him, scorched beyond repair. Thomas stood still, his eyes locked on Daniel, not with triumph, but with the cold ache of a father whose blood had betrayed him. The pain was sharp, slicing deeper than surgery ever could. But alongside the grief was a dark satisfaction. Justice, raw and merciless, had begun its work. Daniel's voice cracked now, the smooth confidence gone. "You set me up," he snarled, his eyes darting wildly around the room. "You wanted to humiliate me." Thomas's reply was ice. "No, Daniel. You humiliated yourself. All I did was let the world hear who you truly are." The ballroom murmured with agreement, whispers rising like a tide. Phones were lifted, cameras recording every moment, capturing his downfall from every angle. Investors who had once praised him now pulled out, murmuring about reputations, about liability. Catherine's brothers moved closer to her, shielding her from the man she had almost married. For a moment Daniel looked like a child again, lost, cornered, trembling, but then arrogance tried to resurrect itself in his posture. He puffed out his chest, opened his mouth as though to spin another lie. But no one listened. The evidence lay in the folder, the voice on the recorder, the disgust in every guest's stare. His empire had evaporated in minutes, stripped bare by the truth. Thomas felt his chest tighten, not from weakness, but from the weight of finality. This was the end of illusions. The boy he had raised no longer stood before him. What remained was a man undone by his own greed, his own arrogance. And though it tore at his heart, Thomas knew this was the only way. He closed the recorder, the red light blinking off. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside, heavier than the ocean's roar. It was the silence of judgment of a crowd that had seen a man fall and would never let him rise again. Thomas turned his cane, striking against the marble floor once more, and walked toward the exit. The guests parted around him, some nodding with quiet respect, others staring with wide-eyed awe. Behind him, Daniel's voice cracked into pleas, into denials, but no one listened anymore. The mask was gone, the truth laid bare. At the door, Thomas paused, glancing once more at the scene he had orchestrated. Catherine's family stood united, her father already speaking in clipped tones to an attorney. Investors whispered in huddled groups, pulling out their phones, cutting ties with haste. Daniel stood alone at the center, the ring heavy in his palm, the folder of evidence before him like a sentence passed. Thomas's eyes were cold, but somewhere deep the ache of Linda's absence pressed against him. He whispered in his mind to her, "He proved his worth, Linda, just not the way you hoped." And as he stepped out into the night air, the weight of the ballroom's silence behind him, he knew the reckoning was not finished, because humiliation was only the beginning. The law would come next, and Daniel's fall had only just begun. The ballroom that had once pulsed with laughter now throbbed with the restless energy of scandal. Guests who minutes earlier had toasted Daniel as a rising star now leaned into one another in hushed tones, their eyes darting, their phones raised to capture every fractured moment of his downfall. Catherine stood rigid in her silk gown, her face pale, her lips pressed into a line of fury and humiliation. Without a word, she pulled the glittering ring from her finger and let it fall into Daniel's hand. The sound of metal against skin was small, but in the charged silence it struck like thunder. Her father turned his back on Daniel without hesitation, his arm wrapping protectively around his daughter's shoulders as he ushered her toward the exit. Catherine's mother followed, her eyes flashing with cold contempt, her voice hissing words that cut through the air. "You've disgraced us." Within seconds, the Johnson family was gone, leaving behind only the echo of their rejection. Daniel stood alone in the center of the ballroom, his posture sagging, the diamond ring clenched in his fist like a piece of shrapnel. Faces that had once lit up at his smile now looked at him with suspicion, disgust, even pity. Phones hovered in every direction, recording his shame, live-streaming his ruin. Every second of his unraveling was being documented, sent out into the world, impossible to bury. Thomas remained where he was, his figure steady, his cane planted firmly on the marble floor. His voice, when it came, cut through the chatter with icy precision. "Blood," he said, his gaze fixed on his son, "does not excuse betrayal." The words landed heavy, final, each syllable slicing away the last illusions Daniel might have clung to. The weight of his father's declaration buckled Daniel's knees. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but the words tangled in his throat. "Dad," he stammered, but his voice cracked thin and desperate. He looked around wildly, searching for an ally, someone willing to stand beside him. But the crowd had already chosen sides, and it wasn't his. Investors slipped toward the exits, murmuring about contracts and liabilities. Former friends avoided his eyes, pulling their spouses close, retreating to safer corners of the room. Even those who had once envied him now watched with a grim kind of satisfaction, as though witnessing cosmic balance restored. Daniel dropped the ring, its metallic clatter echoing through the silence, and lurched forward, hands trembling. "You set me up!" he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. "This was all your plan, wasn't it? You couldn't stand to let me succeed, so you destroyed me." Thomas's eyes did not waver. "You destroyed yourself. I only let the world see what you are." The words hit harder than any fist. Daniel staggered back, his chest heaving, his face contorting between rage and desperation. He could feel the walls of the ballroom closing in the eyes of 200 witnesses, cutting into him, their judgment stripping him bare. Every lie, every forged signature, every boast had collapsed into rubble at his feet. The whispers grew louder, phones capturing every flinch, every bead of sweat sliding down his temple. His empire wasn't just crumbling, it was being dismantled, live, piece by piece, in front of the very people whose approval he had built his identity upon. He turned toward the exit, but even that offered no escape. Guests parted not in respect but in recoil, creating a corridor lined with eyes that condemned him. Each step he took seemed heavier than the last, the air thick with disgrace. He tried to straighten his shoulders to recover some fragment of dignity, but the weight of exposure bent him low. Thomas remained still, his face carved with sorrow and resolve. He had not wanted this end, not truly. No father dreamed of seeing his son undone in public, reduced to ashes of his own making. Yet beneath the heaviness in his chest, there was a grim satisfaction, a justice that could not be denied. For years he had let Daniel's arrogance go unchecked, believing love was enough to save him. Tonight proved love without consequence was nothing but indulgence, and indulgence had birthed betrayal. As Daniel reached the doors, voices chased him down. Catherine's brothers, their words sharp and merciless. "You'll never come near her again." Investors muttering. "Contracts void, every deal off the table." A guest with a raised phone whispering gleefully, "This will be everywhere by morning." The double doors closed behind him with a thud, leaving Thomas in the ballroom filled with whispers and stares. He felt the ache of his heart, not the physical one carved open by surgeons, but the deeper one carved open by blood and betrayal. And yet he stood taller, his breath steady. Justice had begun. He turned slowly, facing the crowd, who now watched him with a mixture of awe and unease. They saw a man who had been betrayed but not broken. A father who had laid down the truth with precision and let the world decide. And the world had decided. Margaret's voice, calm and firm, reached his ear. "It's done. He can't recover from this." Thomas's reply was quiet, measured. This was only the beginning. Public shame will tear away his allies, but the law will do the rest. He lifted his cane, walking toward the exit, every step echoing the weight of inevitability. The crowd parted for him now, not with contempt, but with respect. Cameras swung from Daniel's collapsed figure to Thomas's steady frame, capturing the contrast between a man who built and a man who destroyed. Outside, the night air was cool against his face. The city lights glittered in the distance, indifferent, eternal. He drew in a deep breath, the ache of loss heavy, but the fire of justice burning steady. He knew the reckoning was not finished. Humiliation was only one piece of the sentence. The real end would come when the law laid its hand on his son's shoulder, when the arrogance was stripped not just by whispers, but by chains. And as Thomas stepped into the waiting car, he allowed himself one final thought. Daniel had fallen, but the ground had not yet finished rising to meet him. The night after the engagement party bled into a gray dawn, and the house felt different, emptier, colder, though nothing in it had changed. Thomas sat in his study, the recorder on the desk before him, the folders stacked neatly in rows like soldiers ready for war. His reflection in the window was stark, the lines of age deeper. His shoulders heavier, but his eyes carried the same glint that had once built an empire from nothing. He had exposed Daniel to the world, stripped the mask away, but there was one final step left. Truth without consequence was only spectacle, and Thomas knew justice demanded more. By noon he was at the police precinct, the evidence case in his hand. The desk sergeant, skeptical at first, stiffened as the documents piled up, contracts bearing forged signatures, video footage of Daniel at Wilson Coastal voice recordings that admitted everything. Margaret had joined him, her presence commanding, as she outlined the charges: forgery, fraud, embezzlement, wire transfers through shell accounts. The officer called in a detective, then another. Soon the room buzzed with the gravity of the case. When Thomas finished, silence fell. The detective in charge finally spoke. "Mr. Miller, this is more than enough. We'll secure the warrants." His voice was even professional, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of respect. That evening Daniel was led out of his downtown apartment in handcuffs. His once flawless suit wrinkled his expression, a mixture of disbelief and rage. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, neighbors whispered from their windows. The same city that had once applauded his ambition now turned its lens on his disgrace. Catherine's family made no statement. Investors refused to comment, and the Johnson name distanced itself with a swiftness that left him utterly alone. The trial came months later, but its outcome had already been written in the pages Thomas provided. The judge listened to the recordings, watched the surveillance, studied the signatures. Daniel's attorneys tried to spin stories of confusion, of mental lapses, of misunderstandings between father and son. But the evidence was relentless, undeniable, and finally the verdict was read aloud, guilty on multiple counts. Years in prison. No parole for the first stretch. His fortune seized, his reputation obliterated. Thomas sat in the courtroom, cane in hand, his face solemn. He did not celebrate when the sentence was handed down. He did not smirk at his son's collapse. He only closed his eyes for a moment, feeling both the weight of victory and the sting of loss. After the gavel fell, Daniel turned once toward him, his eyes wild, his mouth twisting as if to spit blame or beg mercy. Thomas met his gaze steadily, unflinching, and though he never spoke aloud in the silence of his heart, the words formed clear and unshakable. "I love you, son." But love cannot erase the truth. That was the paradox of his victory. Justice was not triumph, it was balance. It was pain, tempered by necessity, grief, tempered by duty. Thomas walked out of the courthouse, not lighter, but steadier. The sun sharp against his face, the air tasting faintly of salt carried in from the Atlantic. Back at home, he unlocked the drawer of his study and placed Linda's letter back inside, resting it atop the trust documents and the photographs. He sat at her desk, his hand resting on the envelope, and whispered as if she were still listening. "It's done, Linda." He proved himself, not in the way you dreamed, but in the way the world required. The ache of her absence pressed against him, but alongside it came something else: release. For years he had carried Daniel's mistakes on his shoulders, bearing the weight of hope that his son would change, that redemption could come without consequence. Now that weight was gone. It had been carved away by betrayal and burned off by truth. What remained was not joy but clarity, a stillness that felt almost like peace. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ocean. The waves crashed steady against the shore, endless and indifferent. The house might have been sold, the cars lost, but the sea remained constant and eternal. So too did his resolve. He had chosen justice over vengeance, truth over illusion. And though it had cost him his son, it had saved what mattered most: his integrity, his wife's legacy, his own name. The phone buzzed with messages from reporters seeking comment, from old friends offering condolences, from investors praising his strength. Thomas ignored them all. Public opinion meant nothing. The only judgment he cared for had already been delivered. That night he sat alone on the porch, the cold wind whipping against his face, the stars sharp above him. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the ocean fill the silence. The war was over. The empire he had built stood unbroken, and though his heart carried scars deeper than the surgeons had ever cut, he felt the strange, solemn peace of a man who had done what was necessary. In the distance, the lighthouse beams swept across the waves, steady and unyielding. Thomas lifted his gaze toward it, his voice low, steady, almost a vow. The truth stands. Always. And as the night stretched on, he knew this was not the end of his story. It was simply the beginning of living with the kind of freedom only truth can bring. Life has a way of teaching us that love, while powerful, cannot blind us to truth. In Thomas's story, we see how unchecked forgiveness turned into indulgence, and indulgence paved the way for betrayal. Many older adults know the tension between protecting our children and holding them accountable. The lesson here is clear. Love must be paired with boundaries, and trust must be earned, not simply given because of blood ties. Justice is not born out of anger, but from the need to preserve dignity, integrity, and legacy. For seniors especially, this reminds us that our years of experience give us the wisdom to see beyond charm and excuses. We must never allow guilt or sentiment to silence our better judgment. Doing what is right may come with pain, but it also brings peace. The kind of peace that lets us sleep at night knowing we stood firm for truth. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what life lessons have you carried with you about family trust and justice?